In the early hours of March 23rd, the war appeared to slow, but only on the surface. From Washington, a signal emerged that suggested something unexpected. The United States would delay a planned strike on Iran's power grid by 5 days. The explanation was simple. Conversations had been very good and effective. For a brief moment, that statement moved faster this. Oil prices dropped. Stocks surged. Markets reacted as if a turning point had arrived. But almost immediately, a second signal. Tehran rejected the premise entirely. No negotiations, no direct contact, no agreement. And while those two Israeli strikes were still hitting Tehran, this was the defining pattern of those 24 hours. Diplomacy appeared, but did not replace combat. Markets reacted, but did not stabilize. And beneath both, something more structural began to take shape. Because what changed between March 23 and March 24 was not the intensity of the war. It was its focus. The conflict was no longer centered only on military targets. It was beginning to concentrate on something far more consequential: energy. At NEO 124 UTC on March 23rd, a Reuters report outlined a critical development. U.S. President Donald Trump stated that discussions with Iran had been productive enough to justify postponing a planned strike on Iran's electrical grid. The delay would last 5 days, allowing time for further contact. On its surface, this appeared to be a diplomatic opening, but the details mattered. The target under consideration was not a missile base or a military installation. It was Iran's power infrastructure. That alone marked a significant shift. Electrical networks are not simply components of military capability. They are the foundation of civilian life, industrial output, and command systems. Almost immediately, Iran rejected the premise of negotiations. Officials denied that any direct or indirect talks had taken place in the way described by Washington. At the same time, Tehran maintained a consistent position. The Strait of Hormuz would only be reopened if the United States and Israel ceased their attacks. This moment established a contradiction that would define the rest of the timeline. One side signaling progress, the other rejecting it. And neither side stepping back from the underlying conflict. The 5-day delay did not pause the war. It exposed its next phase. At 05:05 UTC, another Reuters update clarified the direction of escalation. Iran's Revolutionary Guard issued a direct warning. If Iran's electrical infrastructure were targeted, the response would be immediate and proportional. Israeli power plants would become targets. Facilities supplying electricity to U.S. bases across the region would also be included. This statement did not introduce a new weapon. It introduced a new category of targets: electricity. Power systems are not isolated assets. They connect multiple layers of modern society. Military bases depend on continuous energy supply for operations, communications, and defense systems. In the Gulf, desalination plants rely on stable power to provide water. Urban centers depend on uninterrupted electricity to maintain order. A strike on the grid is not limited to infrastructure. It affects everything attached to it. By framing retaliation in these terms, the IRGC made the shift explicit. The war would not remain confined to conventional military exchanges. It would extend into the systems that sustain both civilian and military life. This was one of the clearest signals of escalation on March 23rd, not because of what had already happened, but because of what had now been defined as legitimate targets. Running parallel to these developments was a constant reference point that did not change throughout the timeline: the Strait of Hormuz. From the earliest report of the day, Tehran's position was tied directly to this corridor. Iran reiterated that the reopening of Hormuz would depend on the cessation of U.S. and Israeli attacks. This condition anchored the conflict to a geographic point that carries global consequences. Approximately one-fifth of the world's traded oil passes through this narrow waterway. That figure is not abstract. It represents a continuous flow of tankers transporting energy from Gulf producers to markets across Asia, Europe, and beyond. The movement is constant, tightly managed, and highly sensitive to disruption. The significance of Hormuz lies not only in its volume but in its vulnerability. It does not need to be closed to affect the global system. It only needs to be placed under credible threat. A shift in risk perception can alter shipping patterns, increase costs, and influence pricing within hours. This is why the Strait appears repeatedly across diplomatic statements, military warnings, and market reactions. It is the point where military pressure, energy supply, and global economics intersect. By 1129 UTC, the impact of earlier statements had already reached global financial markets. Reuters reported a sharp reversal driven by the announcement of the delayed strike on Iran's power grid. Oil prices fell significantly. Equity markets rose. Bond yields adjusted as investors interpreted the signal as a potential de-escalation. But that movement did not hold, because at the same time, Iranian media were rejecting the idea of negotiations. The contradiction introduced uncertainty into the system. Markets were no longer reacting to confirmed changes in the conflict. They were reacting to competing narratives. Later developments reinforced this instability. At 12:07 UTC, Israel confirmed that it was conducting strikes in Tehran. This occurred while Washington was still signaling progress in discussions. The coexistence of these two realities, diplomatic messaging and active military operations, made it difficult for markets to establish a stable expectation. By the early hours of March 24th, the pattern continued. Oil prices moved upward again, reaching around $101 per barrel, as traders reassessed supply risk following Iran's denial of talks. In Asian trading, equities remained supported, but oil showed pronounced volatility. This sequence demonstrated a key characteristic of the current phase. The war was no longer influencing markets only through physical disruption. It was influencing them through signals. At 15:06 UTC, Reuters reported a development that moved beyond signals and into physical market behavior. Traders were offering Iranian oil to India at a premium of $6 to $8 per barrel above Brent. This detail carries significant weight. Under normal conditions, Iranian oil, constrained by sanctions, would be expected to trade at a discount. Buyers typically demand lower prices to compensate for regulatory and logistical risks. But in this case, the opposite occurred. The price moved above the benchmark. This shift was linked to a partial easing of sanctions by Washington, intended to reduce pressure on the global energy market. However, the result revealed something deeper. Supply was being reprioritized. Access to barrels was becoming more important than price. This is how energy systems begin to reconfigure under stress. Trade flows adjust. Pricing relationships change. Buyers and sellers reposition. Unlike market volatility, which can reverse quickly, these adjustments can persist. Once supply chains begin to shift, they tend to stabilize around new patterns. The offering of Iranian oil at a premium was not just a commercial detail. It was evidence that the conflict had begun to reshape the movement of energy itself. At 1910 UTC, the focus on Hormuz moved into a new domain. Bahrain submitted a draft resolution to the United Nations Security Council calling for authorization to use all necessary means to protect maritime navigation in and around the Strait. This step elevated the issue from regional concern to international agenda. The language used in the proposal is significant. All necessary means implies the possibility of enforcement measures, including coordinated naval activity. According to Reuters, the draft had backing from Gulf Arab states and the United States, although opposition from Russia or China remained likely. This development reflects a broader shift. Hormuz was no longer only a point of military tension. It was becoming a matter of global security governance. The involvement of the Security Council introduces additional actors, additional interests, and additional constraints. It also increases the complexity of the situation as multiple powers engage with overlapping objectives. In a narrow and heavily trafficked corridor, increased presence can reduce uncertainty in one sense, while increasing the risk of miscalculation in another. This is how localized conflict can expand without a single decisive event. Through accumulation, the developments of these 24 hours carry direct implications beyond the region. Because oil is priced within a global system, even as production sources diversify, pricing remains interconnected. Movements in one part of the system influence outcomes elsewhere. The sequence observed between March 23 and March 24 demonstrates this connection. A statement regarding a delayed strike contributed to a drop in oil prices. A denial of negotiations contributed to a rebound. These movements occurred within a short time frame, reflecting sensitivity to perceived changes in supply risk. For the United States, this linkage operates through pricing rather than physical supply alone. Changes in global benchmarks influence fuel costs domestically. Fuel costs affect transportation. Transportation costs influence broader price levels. This chain does not require long delays to become visible. It operates continuously. The events of these 24 hours show that energy-related developments within the conflict are capable of producing measurable effects beyond the immediate area, not through direct disruption alone, but through expectation. Taken together, the timeline from March 23 to March 24 presents a consistent pattern. Military operations continued. Diplomatic signals emerged. Markets reacted. And energy systems began to adjust. The war did not pause. It shifted. The potential targeting of power infrastructure, the explicit threat of retaliation against electrical systems, the continued focus on the Strait of Hormuz, the adjustment of oil pricing and trade flows, and the movement of the issue into the United Nations all point in the same direction. Energy has become a central dimension of the conflict, not as a secondary effect, but as a primary arena. This does not mean that conventional military operations have ceased. They continue, but they now exist alongside a parallel dynamic, one that operates through infrastructure, supply, and pricing. And unlike traditional battlefields, this dynamic does not remain contained. It connects outward. What these 24 hours reveal is not a resolution. It is a transition. The conflict has not moved away from force. It has expanded into systems, electrical networks, maritime routes, energy flows. These systems are interconnected, and changes within them can extend beyond the immediate context in which they occur. The events between March 23 and March 24 illustrate how quickly signals, decisions, and actions can interact across these layers. A delayed strike, a rejected negotiation, a warning of retaliation, a shift in pricing, a proposal at the United Nations. Each element contributes to a broader pattern, and that pattern suggests that the next phase of the conflict may be defined less by where strikes occur and more by how systems respond. Because once those systems begin to shift, their effects are not easily contained.